Hello again. I thought I'd talk about a subject which interests me today, which is Israel. There's a lot of secrecy surrounding the Israeli nuclear arsenal, so I thought I would say a few words about that and explain what the current situation is with Israel, and also about how they came to have so many nuclear weapons. Almost from its very foundation in 1948, there were those in Israel who believed that the country's ultimate security lay in the acquisition of nuclear weapons, or atom bombs as they were then known, which is why in the 1950s, with help from the French, the Israelis built a reactor at a place called Dimona, which is in the middle of the Negev desert. Throughout the 50s and early 60s, they enriched uranium there, constructed beryllium tampers, devised neutron sources, dropped blueprints for weapons, did everything in fact short of actually putting together a bomb. The main reason for this was that the state of Israel was massively dependent on America and American aid, and the Americans were resolutely opposed to any form of proliferation. All this changed in 1967. By the mid-1960s, at the height of the Cold War, it was plain as a pikestaff to the Americans that the whole of the Middle East was slipping further each day into Soviet hegemony. There was one exception to the trend: Israel. When in the summer of 1967, Soviet-backed states surrounding Israel threatened her with destruction, a war was inevitable. Israel struck first, defeating the three neighbouring countries in less than a week. The Israelis knew that despite this victory, things might turn out very differently in the future if another war broke out. They therefore decided the time had come to make themselves invincible against attack. The order was given to begin production of nuclear warheads at Dimona. It was guessed rightly, with only one dependable ally in such a critically strategic part of the globe, the Americans would probably now turn a blind eye to any Israeli activity in this field. The first warhead was completed in December 1967. To its casing was welded the words "never again" in Hebrew and English. This was of course a reference to the Holocaust. By the time of the Yom Kippur War, also known as the October War in 1973, the Israelis had 19 nuclear weapons. They were all powerful, relatively crude fission devices. When Syria and Egypt launched a surprise attack in October 1973, things looked pretty bleak for Israel. The Syrians quickly overrun the Golan Heights, and the Egyptians crossed the Suez Canal and were racing across the Sinai towards the Israeli border. Now, if ever, was the time for the Israelis to use their ultimate weapon. The only trouble was, if they exploded one of their 20-kiloton devices near the Syrian forces massed on the Golan Heights, they would destroy half of the Galilee in the process. Israel is such a tiny country, it's about the size of Wales, that any bomb of about the size of that used at Hiroshima is liable to take out a large chunk of the country if used anywhere on or near the borders. In the event, the Americans organised an airlift of supplies, the Israelis counter-attacked, and the crisis passed. Israel learned a very valuable lesson from all this. They needed a far more flexible nuclear response. In other words, they needed to develop weapons which they could actually use without devastating their own territory. As the State of Israel entered the 80s, it was in possession of literally hundreds of nuclear weapons. The vast majority of these were not the crude fission devices which they had first developed, the Israeli command having decided instead to rely almost exclusively upon more sophisticated thermonuclear weapons. About a third of their stockpile will in the future consist of enhanced radiation weapons, or neutron bombs as they were popularly known. The typical nuclear or thermonuclear explosion gives out roughly 80% of its energy in the form of heat and blast. The remaining 20% is given out as high energy neutrons, alpha particles, gamma rays and so on. With the neutron bomb, these percentages are reversed. In other words, only 20% is given out as heat and light and the rest as radiation. This is really useful if instead of knocking out a whole city, you simply wish to stop an armoured column in its tracks. All those energetic neutrons will penetrate tanks, killing the occupants without devastating the area or leaving lingering long-term radiation. This is very handy if, like Israel, you're a small country fighting back an enemy on your very doorstep, as it were. The term neutron bomb is something of a misnomer because most enhanced radiation weapons are not bombs at all, but artillery shells. There's one great disadvantage to having, as the Israelis do, so many neutron bombs in your arsenal at any given time. Chief drawback is that they use tritium gas in order to boost the initial fission blast. Tritium gas is very radioactive, and moreover it has a pretty short half-life, little over 12 years. A simple calculation tells you that if you want your tritium gas to be over 90% pure, which in the case of these weapons is absolutely vital, then each of your shells will have a shelf life of just under 2 years. What this means in practice is that every 18 months or so, each artillery shell must be returned to the place of manufacture for the tritium to be replaced. This is why, despite some initial enthusiasm in the 1970s, NATO forces in Europe never really took to the neutron bomb. It was too much hassle to keep shipping them off to England or America to have the tritium changed. When you only have a handful of nuclear bombs, you tend to treat them a little bit like the crown jewels. They're heavily guarded, seldom moved from place to place, and generally viewed with a proper amount of respect, even awe. Familiarity breeds contempt, though, and so when there are hundreds of weapons like that, people get a little blasé about the whole subject. Whereas in the late 60s and early 70s, moving a warhead from Dimona to the assembly plant at Yodafat, east of Haifa, had entailed a heavily armed convoy with roads blocked off by the army. Today, shells are transported from one end of the country to the other with only the lightest of security. The Israeli nuclear arsenal currently consists of just under 300 warheads. These are fitted to surface missiles such as the Jericho-2, freefall bombs, submarine-launched cruise missiles, mines and artillery shells. About a third of the warheads, 108 to be precise, are assigned to the 3 battalions of nuclear artillery which provide the backbone of the IDF's defence against invasion. These consist of 36 175mm self-propelled guns, 12 for each battalion, with a few larger 205mm pieces. Their average range is 25 miles and the standard issue munitions are 1 kiloton enhanced radiation shells. Each gun is nominally allocated 3 shells, although in practice they seldom see the genuine article. These are kept in 2 main stockpiles, one at Elaban in the Galilee and another at the Tel Nov fighter base near Rehovot.